I'm going to be talking a little bit about the One Laptop Per Child project, which is an effort that I've been involved in for a couple of years, and some of the connections to partially open data and learning here. Here's some of my coordinates, Google+, Twitter, if you're interested in keeping in touch. One of the things I want to say is that, so far also in discussions on our table, we've often talked about developing nations and developing world as though it were only Africa. There's actually a whole lot of other places that supposedly fit that definition. And some of the things I'm going to be talking about are based on experience of working in or working with projects in Nepal, Peru, and Zambia. So basically, the One Laptop Per Child project is probably still most famous for this notion of having this $100 laptop, which was introduced back in 2005. But over the course of the years, especially in 2008, 2009, it kind of dropped off the media radar of most people. So I want to start by telling you a little bit about the context and the state the project is currently in, just to give some context of some things I'm going to say afterwards. The whole notion, as the name already implies, of one laptop per child is that every child gets a laptop. And every child supposedly uses that laptop as an educational tool. The thing looks like this right now. I've got one of the units here with me. It's called the EXO laptop, and if you want, you can play around with it afterwards in lunch break or in the evening in the pub. What's nice about it, it's not just a regular laptop, but you can also fold it in kind of a tablet screen, so it also serves as an e-reader, so you've got a lot of connection to, open libraries, accessing Wikipedia, which is, distributing all of those laptops, and so on and so forth. What's interesting is that all PC is built around what they refer to as the 5 principles. The first one, child ownership, is kind of self-explanatory. So the laptops are really property of the child. It's not something that the teacher owns, not something the parents owns, not something school owns, but actually every child gets a laptop and gets to use that laptop ideally not just in school, but also for learning outside of school. Because I think also when we think about education, many of us get kind of sucked into this thinking of education as only happening in schools, this odd box that stands around. But the fact is, I think, and many of you will probably know it from your own experiences, that a lot of learning, and in many ways, a lot of the most relevant learning in your life actually happens outside of schools. So this is why the idea is that the laptop is really owned by the child. The next one is low ages. Many of the discussions also on the table we had now about higher education and secondary education learning, and all PC is really focused on primary school age children. So in most countries that means 6 to 12 years old. Saturation, what they mean is that the whole idea of one laptop per child is supposed to be taken seriously. So every child in a country, or on a smaller scale, in a region, in a city, gets a laptop. So it's not just one classroom in a school, it's not just one school in a city, literally everybody gets a laptop, and that's saturation. Connectivity, I think in many ways what realize, especially with things like mobile phones, if I don't have an internet connection, like here, because I'm from Austria and I don't have roaming enabled here, this thing becomes actually kind of useless. I mean, I can write text messages, I can take photos, but it kind of reduces my use of this device to like 10% in many ways. So I think connectivity is a really important aspect. At the same time, when we've heard about the mention of the importance of offline in the beginning, I think when we talk about connectivity, we shouldn't just be thinking of being connected to the internet with like a 100 megabit connection or something, but a lot of the value of connectivity actually comes from local connectivity. So if I think about my Twitter stream right now, I'm actually getting the most value out of my Twitter stream now from people which are posting from inside this room. And with Twitter we need the internet, but if we had like a local room that's just connected in here, then that's connectivity and that brings a lot of value. So I think that's an important component. And last but not least, and the strongest connection to open data, is that all PC is very mended to this idea of using free and open source software, open educational resources, Creative Commons licensed materials, and so on and so forth. On the software side of things, this is really implemented in this thing, and that's called Sugar. Sugar is a learning platform, an open source platform that's built on Linux, that's used as the software to run on the laptop. So it's not OS X, it's not Windows, it's a specialized software interface and platform that was developed on the one hand really for children, Because if you think about it, are files and folders and all those hierarchies and concepts really the best way to teach a 7-year-old in Rwanda or Nepal how to actually use a computer? I mean, I don't think so. And on the other hand, it's really also about making it more accessible to people who live in a very social, cultural context. Again, going back to files and folders, the only thing or the only reason historically while we're dealing with those concepts is because computers used to be used for office automation. And in Office, you had files and folders, and that's the mental model we apply to computers. But is it really the most appropriate one in a global perspective? I don't think so. And some of those notions are really implemented in Sugar. Now, the reality today is that approximately 2.5 million children and teachers around the world have such a laptop. So we're not talking about some sort of academic research effort anymore. We're not talking about something that happens in one city or in one country or something. This is happening on a very, very large scale, which is why I think OLPC in some sense is a really interesting platform for any kinds of experiments and projects around open education. It's currently active in approximately 40 countries. You've got a long list here going from A, like Afghanistan, to C, like Zambia. And you'll probably find many places that you yourself have visited or have worked in or have projects in or friends in. So again, just to emphasize, this is something that is happening on a global scale today. This is not limited to a couple of countries. This is really happening in a lot of different places and happening in what I mentioned before, a lot of different contexts. So I think there's some universal or almost universal applicability of some of the lessons and things that we have learned here. What's important is that in many of those countries, the common factor is that they use those green laptops. Yet, because of the given context, one OLPC project in one country can't necessarily be compared to an OLPC project in a different country. There are a couple of dimensions or aspects that are really different between them. One of them are the goals, for example. So in Nepal, which is one of the places where I worked for a little while, a couple of years ago, the goal of the local OLPC project was very much to improve Nepali literacy, English literacy, and numeracy. Because those were identified by the NGO that was implementing the project there as the key challenges to education. In Uruguay, for example, the basic notion was to close a social equity gap and to say what some people have called, turning a privilege into a right by actually connecting everybody and every child and every teacher and every school to the internet and giving them their own appropriate device. So there's already a broad spectrum of different goals here. Another one is the organization, In Uruguay or Rwanda or Peru, for example, the project is being implemented by the government via ministries of education in some places. In other places, such as Uruguay, they actually set up a whole separate organization to implement things. Whereas in other places, such as, for example, Zambia, Nepal, Kenya, and so on and so forth, it's small NGOs or local communities or grassroots organizations that are implementing that. And of course, it makes a big difference, not just in terms of the scale, but in terms of also possible openness and resources and so on and so forth, whether a government is implementing something or a small organization. And another factor I think that you really have to factor in some of those discussions is size. I mean, if you ever wondered what 40,000 laptops looked like, this is kind of an impression. That was a warehouse in Lima, Peru, which I visited in 2010, and they were in the preparation stages for distributing 40,000 laptops out of 800,000 laptops that they've distributed in the country. And it's a very different thing to do something like that than to have a project run in one school with 100 laptops and so on. Next to one of my favorite words, which is context, and that connects a little bit also with what Daniela was talking about in terms of infrastructure and available infrastructure data. Those are two schools which I visited in Peru. Both of them are categorized as rural schools according to some criteria by the Ministry of Education in Peru. What's interesting is the one school on the left is about an hour outside of the next major city. It's a very small school, very rural. Most of the pupils there have to walk for like half an hour to get there. They have limited infrastructure, no internet access, electricity, yes, but only limited number of outlets. The other one is a rural school, but it's, essentially on the former outskirts of the city. It's not part of the city. They have internet access there. All the students are from the houses around the area. It's much, much bigger. And so you immediately say, just because of the infrastructure, I mean, for example, the number of electricity outlets and having internet access or not, using any sort of technology in that environment, it's going to be very, very different. So, for example, I saw one of the data sheets that the Ministry of Education had about those schools, and both of them, there was a column saying access to electricity, and both of them had access to electricity. But the one on the left actually only had 4 outlets per room, and that was it. And if they had connected all their computers at the same time to charge them, the whole grid would have gone down in the area because they had electricity, but it actually wasn't good enough. And I had stories about schools which also supposedly had electricity, but that meant a single outlet and a single light bulb in the principal's room. So here, very basic infrastructure data can actually make a whole lot of difference. And when I was putting the slides together, one initial title for that slide I had is that bad data is worse than no data. Because we rely on the data and we think it's accurate and we make decisions based on it, but it can be very, very misleading. So I think this is an area where open data or any data collection at all and keeping data up to date could be a very, very useful thing to have. I'm going to briefly talk about Uruguay because in many ways it's one of the most interesting countries, not just when it comes to the one laptop per child project, but when it comes to the use of technology or ICT in education in general. If you don't know Uruguay, small country wedged in between Brazil and Argentina, about 3.5 million inhabitants. Average income, I think right now it's approximately 900 euros, so this is not a poor country or very underdeveloped country, but this is not categorized the first world in most aspects. They have very high literacy levels. If you believe United Nations data, then they actually have higher literacy levels than Austria, which is where I come from, which I found really, really interesting. Yeah. And if you look at indicators like the Human Development Index, it's also kind of in the middle tier, about a third down essentially from the top. Uruguay is a really interesting place for technology and education because they've got 580,000 laptops. And that means that literally every child from grade 1 through grade 9 and every teacher has his or her own individual laptop. The question around that is always, does it work? I mean, does that actually make sense? Sorry?
Does IT work?
Yeah, I mean, does it work? Does IT work? That's kind of the double meaning. We're also making it matter in some sense. I would think, you could write making it matter with IT in the middle as well and see whether that's relevant. And to figure that out, I think you need to look at a lot of different aspects. From a government perspective, the question is it worth the money? Because just as an example, in Peru, they spent approximately $200 million on the purchase of laptops. That doesn't count, the infrastructure, the training, and so on and so forth. This was just one big purchase of devices. And of course the question is, does it really make sense to do that? Because I think especially coming from a technology point of view, and my background is in software engineering, so I can very much relate to that, we often ask, okay, what is the impact that our technology intervention is having? And we kind of look at it like this is a whole separate world. But the question is not necessarily just what kind of impact is it having, but what kind of impact is it having compared to all the other things that we could be doing with that money, with that resources, time, goodwill, and so on and so forth. So from a government perspective, that is, of course, a very interesting question. We were talking about a whole lot of money here. From an educational perspective, whether it's the Ministry of Education, whether it's teachers, whether it's parents, whether it's the pupils themselves, it's also the question, is it worth the effort? For example, in the OLPC project, which is a small project in Paraguay, teachers went through 150 hours of training in the summer vacation. They're also going to ask about the return on investment, because 150 hours is, that's a whole full month of a 40-hour week, and they gave up essentially most of their summer vacation to go through the training. I mean, is it a good thing? If they're not happy about it, then that's an interesting question. So what I came up with over the years is what I've kind of referred to as 6 criteria or kind of basic underlying aspects that you need to consider to even have a chance to have successful interventions based on using ICT in education. The first one is infrastructure. And I think with infrastructure, many of us think about electricity and internet connectivity, and rightfully so. But I think you also need to consider infrastructure in terms of process, in terms of logistics. For example, in Uruguay, during the height of when they were giving out laptops in schools, they distributed 5,000 laptops per day. You need to have a certain infrastructure and logistics in place to actually be able to implement that. The next aspect is maintenance. Because we all know with any sort of technology, regardless of how robust it is, at some point it's going to break down. How do you repair that? If you don't have a 0800 number to call and have a Dell technician come to your place the next day and fix everything. How do you deal also in terms of maintenance with educational content? I mean, one of the beautiful things, in my opinion, about digital content, and Wikipedia shows it really well, is that it's very easy and essentially free to update information. Whereas, if you look at most of the geography or, earth science books that are still available in most schools in the UK and Austria, it will probably still say that Pluto is a planet. Because they simply haven't been updated. But how do you also update and maintain content? Next point, content and materials. Once you have actually the technology in place to be able to access content, the question is, how do you get good content? How do you curate content? How do you rate content? How do you build digital libraries which actually make a lot of sense? Khan Academy was on one of the slides we saw early in the morning. How do you distribute the content? But also one of the things that's really important, I think, when it comes to content and materials is how do you recontextualize it? Not just translate it, but how do you actually make it relevant to the local context? I mean, if you're in Austria, all of our examples in math in primary school about, apples and pears, because that's what we have. That would be pretty useless in Zambia, for example, yeah? Or in Peru, it might be much more relevant to talk about pineapples, because they grow all around the cities. So it's not just about translating it and putting it into a different language, but actually recontextualizing it and reappropriating it. Another aspect which I think is really important, and we also heard it in the morning in regards to the Linked Up project, is that it's very much about community inclusion. So those kinds of projects are not something that should be just carried and executed out by regular government. I mean, education is like one of the core aspects or core subsystems of society at large. I mean, this is something where really it's important to have participation by large parts of our society. And how do you design that? Ministries, I think regardless of which country you go to, are not particularly used to actually dealing with citizens on an eye level and getting them involved. Yeah? But one of the nice examples there about that from Uruguay, which I always like to tell, is at some point they had a problem with a software update in Uruguay. And they had about 50,000 laptops that were deactivated and didn't work anymore. And it would have taken the government weeks and weeks to actually go out into all these different communities and activate all of those laptops one by one again. Instead, what happened is that a lot of volunteers from all over the country came together, said, okay, what can we do to help? And the government then in the end produced a USB stick, which they shared on the internet, everybody could download, and then you had like parents, grandparents, teachers, anyone going from machine to machine to machine to actually fixing that. And they fixed it in probably, 5% or 10% of the time that it would have taken the official government to fix that. So I think, you really have tangible benefits from including the wider community. Teacher training is, again, something we already heard in the morning. I think it's one of the key aspects that you really need to consider in any sort of educational intervention. I'm not going to go into more detail here. And the last aspect, I think, which is particularly important when you talk about open data, is monitoring and evaluation. Because to be able to figure out whether you're actually doing a good job on all of this criteria, you actually need to have data and see what's happening. If you don't know that 50% of your laptops are broken, then you won't be able to do anything against it. If you don't realize that the teacher training is really disliked and hated by most teachers, and that's why they don't take up the content, you're probably not going to change it. If you don't realize that half the country supposedly has electricity in its rural schools, but they don't have it, you have a big issue. So I think this is really an area where monitoring and evaluation and data collection and data processing are a key component. And I think those are really the building blocks to be able to answer the questions I asked before, does IT work? So I think in some sense what we're really looking for, I'm kind of missing something here. There were supposed to be zeros and ones in the middle. I'm not sure what happened to them. But we really want open data to be able to address these things. So after Marieke invited me to give this talk, I just read the email on the way home from work at some point. I just drafted up, literally just off the top of my head, some of the relevant data sets that you could have. And if you look at that, that's a pretty broad spectrum. And that's literally me after 10-hour work days sitting on a metro in Vienna and just coming up with stuff. I mean, it's not exhaustive, it's not perfect, there might be some spelling mistakes in there. But you just see that we have a load, a whole spectrum of data that we need to collect, and that can be very, very relevant for all those kinds of things. If you look at some of the existing evaluations, and this is one of the most comprehensive ones that's being run on the OLPC project, or generally on large-scale ICT and education interventions in developing nations. It's a longitudinal study that's being done by the Inter-American Development Bank in Washington, D.C. in collaboration with the Peruvian Ministry of Education and a local Peruvian NGO. Is at the end of their paper, they've got 8 pages of data sets and indicators that they use. That was a single study. And I actually wanted to start counting how many indicators they had, but I just got lazy and put it all out there. Yeah? Just so you realize, this is a single study done in a single country. And they've got loads and loads of data there. It's not just about the use of the technology, but it's also about infrastructure, about household income from parents, time on task, literacy, digital literacy, numeracy, grades, cognitive skills, creativity, divergent thinking, So it's really, this is really a data-rich environment, an area where data matters a lot to actually understand what is going on a micro level and also on a macro level, I think.
Well, what was their conclusion?
I'll talk about that afterwards, okay? So here's a question that I asked myself also at the beginning of putting up these slides. Why should we care about open data in education in the developing world? First of all, I think, as I kind of alluded to here before, is that collecting data is very expensive and it is a huge effort. And for example, that study in Peru that was done, that's a study for 1.5 years, the initial part of the study, there was a 6-figure dollar amount that thing cost. So, once you actually have the data, I think it actually really makes sense to share that openly so other people can do kind of analysis, can do comparisons, and so on and so forth. Because, actually going out to a lot of rural, remote schools is a very hard and expensive task. So I think once you have done that, and once public money, in most cases it's public money via international organizations or via local governments, once they've spent the money, I think the data should really be available to everyone. The next aspect is really allowing different analysis on existing data. I'm not sure whether you followed that, but in the sphere of economists, it was a big discussion, I think, last year when 2 Harvard economists, Kenneth Rogoff and I forget the other person's name, they had published this really influential data on austerity measures and what kind of level of public debt is an issue and how you deal with that. And they had a problem in the Excel file. And the problem is the Excel file was not published with the research paper in the end. So it actually took a couple of graduate students and researchers a long time to be able to recreate the data. And they found out they had simply forgotten to include a couple of columns in an average or median calculation. And so suddenly you have public policy being influenced or being made based on data that's not publicly available, and that's simply wrong. And it wasn't intentional, probably, yeah? But data really has a big influence on public policy and how money is spent and how decisions are being made. And I think we should really allow for different kind of analysis and interpretations, and also kind of enabling verification of published results. Accountability, I think, is also a big aspect, and not just in developing nations, but the same thing in any other country. I have no clue how the money in Austria in education is actually being spent and what impact it's having and how efficient some measures are. Governments in general don't want to share that kind of data. Yeah? But I think this is really an aspect that's key in terms of transparency. I mean, again, Peru spent $200 million on laptops. Was it a good investment or not? Those kinds of key issues can decide elections. There can be fraud involved. I mean, look at how for example, now Switzerland is spending a couple of billion now on new fighter jets for the army. And even before the deal, you've got all kinds of claims about corruption happening and so on and so forth. And I think, as democracies, we should really hold government accountable, and in many ways, one of the best ways to do it is actually via data. And I think these are really just some of the starting points, and if we put our heads together, we can extend that list, 5 or 10-fold. But I think those are some things that are relevant. Now, why do we think that OLPC is a good platform and community to work with for such efforts? First of all, I mean, data and ICT in general are really great data collection tools. And that's what those things at the heart do. They collect different kinds of data. The next one is that OLPC and a lot of the projects that are going on have been going on for many years. So even if it's on a smaller scale, but also on a larger scale, those are fairly established efforts. So they're not, busy thinking about every day how do I distribute 5,000 laptops, how do I provide the infrastructure, how do I train the teachers. They're in a more advanced phase of the projects, and I think that is absolutely necessary to be able to deal with some of those issues. The next one is that many projects, even if they're government projects, actually have some sort of affinity, at least from key members of their staff, to any sort of openness, just because of the influence that open source and open content and those things have had on the development of OLPC and many of the implementations all around the world. So you don't necessarily need to spend as much time and energy to convince people that being open is a good thing and can enable a lot of great things. The next one is, again, because many of those efforts have been established for quite a while, many of those projects, again, regardless of whether it's a small NGO or whether it's a government project such as Peru, Uruguay, or Rwanda, are increasingly under pressure to answer the question asked before, does it actually work? And to be able to realistically answer the question, they're going to need all that data, and they're going to need to get that sooner rather than later. Already today, there are a couple of countries such as Nepal, Jamaica, Nosikomba, which is an island in Madagascar, and Uruguay, which are actually starting to work on some of those things. So again, we already have some basis there on which we can build upon. And last but not least, and that kind of ties in with what Stefan was saying in the morning, for all the things to succeed, you need different communities of people to work together. The way I've put them here is like this, You need technology people, or in the fields of technology, education, and government, which in many ways, if you combine them, they are really the sweet spot. You had this chain of, data providers, developers and users, and I think these are really the applications that we have, and we really need to center there in the middle. And OLPC, I think, which is nice, already has such a diverse community to do things. But one of the slides I jumped over now is I think there are some good and easy starting points. Because with a lot of projects that are being done, people sit in a room in London and develop solutions which totally don't have anything to do with what people need on the ground. Yeah? And a lot of money is being spent on, academic frameworks and evaluation methodologies and technological frameworks and blah, 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 and it's all essentially for nothing. Ends up in a drawer in Brussels and London and Vienna, but actually has no impact at all. So what I was thinking about is, what are some of the possible quick wins that we could have, where really we show people on the ground what's useful and what can be done and achieved with open data. So I think for children, parents, and teachers, one of the first things that can be done is, actually maybe simply visualize how the laptops are being used. I, for example, on my own laptop have a tool. I mean, it's not an NSA-approved tool, but it's a tool that tracks exactly what I'm doing on the laptop. And at the end of the week, I get an email saying, you spent 15 hours this week on Facebook, which I've categorized as very distracting time, But you have spent 20 hours developing software code, which is really happy, so it's great, And it's kind of a nice way for myself to realize how I'm spending time on a computer. And I think that can be particularly useful also in educational environments. For teachers, a simple app for that matter, or a website or something, where you can track attendance would work wonders. So for example, in Peru, the Ministry of Education actually has no freaking clue how many pupils are there in the schools, yeah? and how much of the time they attend or not attend. I was talking to some of the people, on more of a regional level, and they said it sometimes takes 5 years for data, if it's even available, from the schools to reach a regional head office. So again, people are making a lot of decisions and assumptions, for example, about how many laptops to actually distribute, based on totally wrong data. And for teachers, and I think that's a pretty universal thing around the world, teachers at the beginning or end of a class have to take down who attended something. And if you make it easy for them, again, make it an app, make it a simple website, something, instead of having books and books and books of your data entries, which at the end somebody has to digitize, I think that can be an easy win. Last but not least, again, relating to something I mentioned before, for administrator, I think any sort of infrastructure app would be really useful. Saying, in Brazil, the government's now saying, okay, let's construct libraries. Let's actually figure out by asking the people, who needs library? Who already has a library? Right now, that's simply not happening. All this data is, many years old and simply not up to date. If you really talk to the people, and again, the community inclusion component comes into play, then I think you're going to get a whole lot of useful data which can really make administration much, much better. So, to conclude, and here I'm kind of, echoing what Mike Trucano said, his quote earlier. I think the lack of education or bad education or whatever you want to call it is definitely not a technology or data problem. I think we can all agree on that. However, I do strongly believe, and I think that's something that maybe brings us all together here, that information and communication technologies and data can really be useful tools for societies, for teachers, for parents, for governments to address such challenges. And I think you can really apply this to, health, transparency, and so on and so forth. Technology is not the solution. Technology is a component of a larger tool set to be able to address those kinds of things. The next one is, I think it's really, really, really important, and this can't be emphasized enough, to get the details right. Again, if you don't get the details right, you will never understand the context. If you say it's a school that has electricity but don't realize there's only a single outlet there, then you're just not going to have an appropriate solution for that environment. It's just not going to happen. You really need to look at the details. Next aspect is, and this is something that definitely also comes from the software and technology background, is I think you need to do an incremental approach. Not saying, okay, we're going to start with this massive project, let's eat up $200 million, and kind of see what sticks and see what works out. But I think you need to start on a small scale, learn what works, what doesn't work, what's actually relevant for people and what's not relevant for people, and then actually build on that. And I think what's important here is, and that goes back together also with what Christoph said, I think here it is very much about downscaling and upscaling. Everybody always thinks, let's have a solution that works with 100 kids and then let's scale it up to 10,000 kids. Yeah? On the other hand, I think it would be really important to see when it works for 100 kids, how can we actually make it better for a single kid? Let's look at that data as well. Next aspect is, contrary to all other claims, actually size does matter. If you have a project with 100 laptops and you have 10% of them being broken, you can find someone to actually fix them physically. You can't do that with 1 million laptops. It simply doesn't work. Those things don't scale linearly. The way I always describe this as from a software perspective is, my background is in software engineering. If you ask me to write Facebook for the crowd of people which is in the room right now, I could do it. No, it's maximum 30 people using it at the same time. I've got no freaking clue how to write anything that can be run by 1 million people concurrently. This is not a linear problem. Things really change. When something or a solution to a problem that works at 100 people might not work in 1,000 or 10,000 or million or billion or whatever. And I think, as we saw also in the figures in one of the slides before, the potential target audience for any of those interventions and projects and initiatives, we're talking about millions, hundreds of millions, up to billions of people. So I think we really have to keep that in mind. And the next thing, and this is also very much about openness, I think we have to be honest and learn from our mistakes. In my opinion, one of the first ones to actually really do that on a great grand scale is Engineers Without Borders from Canada. And since 2010, they've released at the end of the year, not just an activity report, but always a failure report. where they just discuss what does not work at all. And I think that's really important openness. Why? And I'm going to close with that, and it's one of my favorite quotes. Don't reinvent the flat tire. If you reinvent the wheel, at least you got a freaking wheel. If you reinvent the flat tire, you got nothing, and it just wastes a whole lot of goodwill, money, and other resources. Thanks a lot.